Charleston, South Carolina, April 1832. The book was already burning when Josephine Merriweather ran into the street. Ash drifted through the night air like black snow, settling on the satin of her widow's dress, catching in her hair, clinging to her lashes until her tears turned it to paste. On the Battery, the sea wind screamed against the mansions as if it too wanted to tear something free. In the courtyard behind the Merriweather house, a small crowd had gathered. Lanterns swung, faces glowed and vanished. Someone had dragged a barrel into the open and filled it with torn pages, letters, scraps of ink-stained paper. The library's heart. Her secret. Their secret. Samuel stood at the edge of the firelight with his hands bound behind him, rope biting into skin that shone with sweat despite the cold. Blood ran from a split at his lip where someone had struck him hard enough to silence a sentence. His eyes were lifted, not to the men who held him, but to Josephine, as if he were trying to memorize her before the world erased him. Gregory Merriweather's voice cut through the wind, calm as a merchant reading figures from a ledger. "This is what happens," he said, "when a slave forgets his place and a widow forgets her duty." A man raised a branding iron from the coals. It glowed red, hungry, alive. Josephine tried to speak. Her throat worked. No sound came out at first, only breath and terror. She pushed forward anyway, stumbling on the hem of her dress, her hands reaching for Samuel as if touch alone could rewrite the law. Samuel shook his head once, slow and fierce, warning her not to come closer, but Josephine had already crossed the line inside herself. Because it wasn't the rope that frightened her most. It was the book in her hand, the one Samuel had read to her in a whisper, the one she had begun to write in the margins with a dream she thought was dead. The flame leapt higher, and the first page curled into nothing. Before we continue, let me ask you, where are you listening from today? Whether you're at home or on the road, I wish you a warm and joyful Christmas. Now, let's get back to the story. Charleston, South Carolina, winter 1831. Before the fire. Before the rope. Before the night when words were treated like crimes. Charleston in the winter of 1831 wore elegance like armor. The harbor lay gray beneath a restless sky, ships rocking gently as if unaware of the human commerce that had built the city's wealth. Sea wind threaded through the narrow streets, carrying the smell of salt, tar, and rice husks. Iron gates clanged softly. Carriages rolled past pastel facades where wealth displayed itself in columns, balconies, and silence. The Merriweather house stood near the Battery, its windows facing the water as if ownership extended even to the horizon. Inside, warmth lingered from constant fires, from heavy draperies, from the unspoken assumption that comfort was a right. Josephine Claire Merriweather lived in that warmth like a ghost. At 20, she was already a widow, dressed in black not only for her husband, but for the girls she had been before marriage claimed her imagination. She moved through the house with careful grace, her posture perfect, her expression composed, performing the role expected of a respectable Southern woman with inherited wealth and inherited obedience. Once, she had devoured books the way other girls devoured sweets. As a child, she hid novels beneath her pillow, read by candlelight until her eyes burned. She imagined herself crossing oceans, writing stories that mattered, living many lives instead of the single narrow one prepared for her. Marriage ended that quietly. Thomas Merriweather had not been cruel in ways that left marks. He was worse. He was dismissive. He laughed at novels as foolish indulgences. He told her imagination was a flaw, not a gift. When he locked the library cabinet and handed the key to his brother for safekeeping, Josephine felt something inside her fold in on itself. After his death, the house reopened its doors, but Josephine did not reopen herself. She spent her days sewing, receiving visitors, managing accounts she did not care about. At night, she stared out at the sea and tried to remember what it felt like to want something that did not come with permission. Downstairs, moving through that same house with trained invisibility, was Samuel. He belonged to the Merriweather estate by law, but nothing in his eyes suggested ownership had succeeded completely. He was tall and spare, his movements economical, his voice rarely raised above necessity. Most people noticed him only long enough to issue commands. They did not notice how carefully he listened. Samuel had learned early that knowledge was dangerous. His mother had taught him letters in whispers, tracing shapes on his palm while the household slept. She taught him that words could open doors no one wanted him to see. When she died, he buried that knowledge deep, showing the world only what it expected: obedience, silence, utility. What he kept was hunger. The Merriweather Library was his private battlefield. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes he was never meant to touch. Histories, poems, novels shipped across the Atlantic for white hands and white minds. Samuel cleaned that room weekly, dusting spines he knew by heart, resisting the ache in his fingers. At night, resistance failed him. He read, standing by the window, moonlight slanting across the pages, careful never to leave a book out of place. He read stories where people chose love over convenience, conscience over safety. Stories that named injustice and dared to imagine its end. Reading did not make him reckless. It made him precise. Josephine noticed the change before she knew its cause. The house felt different after Thomas's death. Quieter, yes, but also watchful, as if it were holding secrets that breathed after dark. She began wandering at night, restless, her mind pacing like an animal denied space. That was when she saw the light. A thin line beneath the library door. Impossible at that hour. Curiosity overcame propriety. She approached silently, heart pounding, and peered inside. What she saw unsettled her more than fear ever had. Samuel, seated on the floor, book open in his hands, lips moving silently as he read. The shock was immediate and profound. A slave reading was not merely disobedience. It was illegal. It was dangerous. It was, to her astonishment, beautiful. Josephine recognized the book at once. Pride and Prejudice, her favorite, the one she had mourned like a friend lost to time. When she stepped inside, the illusion shattered. Samuel stood too quickly. The book fell, his face drained of color. In that moment, all his careful control dissolved into the terror of a man who knew exactly what punishment waited for him. Josephine did not raise her voice. She picked up the book. Her fingers brushed the margin where a note had been written in a careful, slanted hand. A thought, an opinion, a mind at work. Something inside her, long, silent, stirred. She should have called for help, should have enforced the law that protected her position. Instead, she asked a question, and in that question, everything began to change. Charleston, South Carolina. Late winter, 1831. The moment stretched thin between them, fragile as glass. Samuel stood rigid, hands half raised as if the air itself might accuse him. The book lay open on the floor, its pages trembling slightly in the draught from the window. Josephine held it as one might hold a relic, afraid that any sudden movement would shatter what it represented. "You can read," she said at last. It was not an accusation, it was recognition. Samuel's throat tightened. Years of caution pressed down on him at once. "Yes, ma'am," he whispered, "but I swear I never meant harm. I never took anything. I put every book back." "I know," Josephine replied. She had already noticed the precision. The shelves were immaculate, nothing missing, nothing disturbed except the silence that had protected her grief. She looked at the open page. Elizabeth Bennet stood there, defiant and alive, refusing a future chosen for her. Josephine felt the old ache flare sharply, almost painfully. "How long have you been reading here?" she asked. Samuel hesitated, calculating truth against survival. "Since before your husband passed," he said finally. "Only at night, only when the house slept." Josephine closed the book and held it against her chest. "If my brother-in-law finds out?" she said quietly. "They will punish you." "Yes, ma'am. And if the city finds out," she continued, "they could kill you." "Yes, ma'am." The certainty in his answer unnerved her more than fear would have. This was not recklessness. This was devotion. "Why?" she asked. Samuel met her eyes for the first time. There was no challenge in his gaze, only something steady and deep. "Because books remind me I'm human," he said. "And because when I read, I belong to myself." The words struck her harder than any confession of crime. Josephine turned away, pacing the length of the room. Her slippers whispered over the rug. Every lesson she had been taught rose up at once: duty, propriety, law. And beneath them, buried but breathing, her own hunger. She stopped at the desk. The ink bottle sat there unused, dusted but untouched. Slowly, she picked up a sheet of paper. "Sit," she said. Samuel obeyed, though his legs shook as he lowered himself to the floor again. She returned to him, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. "I am not going to report you," she said, "but you must listen carefully." His breath caught. "You will never read here again without my permission," she continued. "You will never take a book unless I am present, and if anyone asks, this never happened." Samuel nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I won't forget." She hesitated, then added the sentence that would undo them both. "And you will read aloud." He stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. "Ma'am?" "Not to everyone," she said. "Only to me. Only here. Only at night." Silence filled the library, thick with consequence. Samuel searched her face, trying to understand the danger from which this request had been born. "Why?" he asked. "Softer now." Josephine looked at the shelves, at the books she had been forbidden to touch for years, at the stories that had once taught her how to dream. "Because I have forgotten how," she said. "And you remember." That was the moment the boundary broke. Not with touch, not with desire, with trust. From that night forward, the library became something else entirely. Not a room of property, but a room of possibility. Samuel read cautiously at first, his voice low, each word measured. Josephine sat opposite him, hands folded in her lap, listening as if oxygen itself flowed from the pages. Each night, he read a little more freely. Each night, she leaned closer, her questions growing bolder, her thoughts sharper. They spoke of characters, of choices, of roads not taken. They did not speak of themselves, yet with every chapter turned, something irreversible unfolded. The space between mistress and slave narrowed, not erased, but challenged. The law still stood. The danger remained. But in the shared glow of lamplight and language, a private world took shape. And with it, the first true threat. Because stories do not remain contained forever. And neither do people who begin to see themselves inside them. Charleston, South Carolina, early spring, 1832. What they built in the library did not announce itself as rebellion. It arrived quietly, wrapped in habit and shadow, disguised as learning. Each night, after the last lamp on the battery dimmed and the house surrendered to sleep, Josephine descended the stairs with measured steps. She carried a shawl even when the fire burned hot, as if the fabric might protect her from the weight of what she was doing. Samuel waited by the window, book already chosen, posture straight, eyes lowered until she spoke his name. At first, she insisted on distance. She sat at the desk. He remained on the floor. The lamplight divided them like an invisible border. He read carefully, voice steady but restrained, as though volume itself might betray them. Josephine listened with her hands clasped tightly together, afraid that if she allowed them to rest freely, they might reach for something forbidden. The stories came alive anyway. Jane Eyre's quiet defiance, Ivanhoe's impossible loyalties, poems that named longing without apology. Each word loosened something Josephine had spent years tightening shut. She began to interrupt him, asking questions, challenging interpretations, arguing about motives and endings. "You think courage always looks like defiance," she said one night, "but sometimes it's endurance." Samuel considered this before answering. "Endurance keeps you alive," he said. "Defiance decides what kind of life it is." She stared at him, struck by the certainty in his tone. This was not the voice of a servant repeating borrowed wisdom. This was a man who had lived inside the consequences of every word he spoke. Slowly, without comment, she moved her chair closer. The distance between them shrank by inches, then by breath. They began to share more than books. Josephine spoke of her marriage, not as a catalogue of cruelty, but as a long erasure. She described how Thomas had laughed when she said she wanted to write, how he called her imagination childish, how the library key had vanished into his brother's pocket as if her mind was something that needed locking away. Samuel listened without interruption. When she finished, he said quietly, "They feared what you might become." She had never thought of it that way. The idea settled into her chest like a truth she had been waiting to hear. In return, he told her about his mother, about learning letters traced in ash on the hearth, about the night she was beaten for teaching him, and how she smiled afterward anyway, blood on her lip, whispering that knowledge was worth pain. Josephine wept openly then, ashamed and unashamed all at once. Samuel did not touch her. He simply kept reading, his voice steady, anchoring her to the room until the storm passed. As weeks turned into months, the rules bent. He began sitting on a chair. She allowed herself to remove her gloves. The lamplight softened, shadows lengthened, and sometimes, when the story demanded it, Samuel's voice grew stronger, more expressive. When he read dialogue, he gave it weight, humor, irony. Josephine laughed aloud for the first time since her husband's death, clapping a hand over her mouth, too late to stop the sound. They froze, listening. Nothing happened. The house kept its secrets. That laughter changed something fundamental. After that night, Samuel stopped lowering his eyes so quickly. Josephine stopped pretending she did not notice the lines of his face when he smiled, the intensity that lived just behind his restraint. She noticed how carefully he chose his words, how deeply he thought before speaking. He noticed how her intelligence sharpened with each conversation, how her questions cut to the heart of every story. They were no longer just reader and listener. They were companions in thought. The danger of that realization arrived without warning. One evening, Josephine asked him to read from a book of poetry. Midway through a passage about longing restrained by duty, Samuel faltered. His voice caught on a line that named desire, not as sin, but as truth. "I'm sorry," he said, closing the book abruptly. "I shouldn't read this." "Why?" she asked. "Because it's not safe," he replied. "Not for you, not for me." Josephine stood. The movement startled them both. She took the book from his hands and read the line aloud herself, her voice clear, unafraid. "Words are only dangerous," she said softly, "when they are true." Their eyes met. The air changed. Samuel rose, compelled by something he did not fully understand. They stood too close now, close enough that Josephine could feel the warmth of him, that Samuel could smell the faint ink and lavender on her skin. He stepped back sharply. "We shouldn't." "I know," she said. Her voice did not waver. "But knowing doesn't make it stop." They did not touch. That restraint was more intimate than any embrace. From then on, the struggle lived in everything, in the way Samuel chose safer books, and Josephine returned to the dangerous ones, in the way their conversations circled around freedom, equality, and choice, without ever naming the word love. In the way silence grew heavy between chapters, charged with what neither dared say. Faith haunted them both. Samuel prayed longer at night, asking forgiveness for thoughts he could not prevent. Josephine knelt beside her bed and begged God not to mistake her awakening for wickedness. Both feared damnation. Both feared a life returned to emptiness more. The house itself seemed to conspire with them. Floorboards creaked at inopportune moments. Shadows shifted when no one moved. Once, a servant passed too close to the library door, and they extinguished the lamp in breathless panic, crouching in darkness until the footsteps faded. Their hands brushed in that darkness. Neither pulled away. It was only a second. Bare skin against skin. But it burned itself into memory with merciless clarity. Afterward, Samuel avoided the library for 3 nights. Josephine waited, pacing, the ache of absence sharper than grief. When he finally returned, he looked older somehow, as if he had wrestled with something vast and lost. "I can't keep pretending this is harmless," he said. Josephine swallowed. "Neither can I." Silence stretched. "If we continue," he went on, "it will destroy us." "Yes," she said, "and if we stop, it will destroy me." The truth settled between them like a verdict. They chose each other without saying it aloud. From that night forward, the bond deepened not through touch, but through surrender. They spoke honestly, fiercely. They argued. They confessed fears. They imagined futures they knew were impossible. Samuel read her dreams aloud from the margins she had begun to write, her handwriting filling the white space around printed words. She was writing again. He was the first to read her stories. And somewhere beyond the library walls, the world sharpened its knives. Because forbidden things do not remain hidden forever. Charleston, South Carolina, spring 1832. Suspicion rarely announces itself with certainty. It arrives as glances that linger too long, as questions asked twice, as doors that seem to close more quietly than before. Josephine felt it first in the household's rhythm. The servants' movements grew careful, their voices lower. A maid who once lingered to talk now slipped away as soon as her task was finished. The cook crossed herself when Josephine passed, as if warding off a misfortune she could not name. Samuel felt it like a tightening rope. The overseer began assigning him tasks closer to the main house, closer to eyes and ears. He was asked where he went at night. He was told to keep his hands visible. Once, a ledger went missing from the study, and though it was found hours later exactly where it belonged, Samuel noticed the way the overseer's gaze fixed on him, sharp and measuring. Gregory Merriweather's presence sealed the danger. He arrived from Savannah with the authority of family and the confidence of a man who believed inheritance entitled him to obedience. He took the master bedroom. He examined accounts. He asked questions Josephine had never been asked before. "You live too quietly," he told her one afternoon, pouring himself a drink she did not offer. "People talk." "I am a widow," Josephine replied. "Quiet is expected." "Not isolation," Gregory said, "and not indulgence." He gestured toward the shelves in the parlor, where books had begun to reappear, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Josephine said nothing. Silence had become her armor. That evening, Gregory summoned the overseer. Samuel watched from the edge of the courtyard as the 2 men spoke in low voices. He could not hear the words, but he recognized the shape of danger in their posture, in the way Gregory pointed toward the house. When Samuel entered the library that night, Josephine knew something was wrong before he spoke. "They're watching," he said quietly. "More closely now." Her fingers tightened around the pages she had been writing on all afternoon. "Because of me?" "Because of us," he answered. The truth of it hollowed her chest. 2 nights later, the first intrusion came. Footsteps outside the library door, a pause, the faint scrape of a key testing the lock. Josephine extinguished the lamp instantly. Darkness swallowed them whole. Samuel reached for her without thinking, his hand finding her wrist, steadying her. They stood pressed close, breath held, listening to the sound of authority, deciding whether to push further. The footsteps retreated. They did not release each other. In the darkness, Josephine felt the pounding of Samuel's heart beneath her palm. It was fast, controlled only by will. She realized then that fear did not belong to her alone. He had far more to lose. "This ends tonight," Samuel whispered. "For your sake." "No," she breathed back. "Don't decide that alone." He turned to face her, close enough that his voice brushed her cheek. "If they discover what we've been doing, they won't ask questions. They won't care that you invited me. They'll say I corrupted you. They'll say I stole from you. And they'll punish me for it." Josephine's throat burned. "And what will they do to me?" He did not answer. He did not need to. The next day, Gregory called Josephine into the study. "I've made arrangements," he said pleasantly. "A suitable match. Mr. Caldwell, a widower, very respectable. You'll be married by summer." Josephine stared at him, disbelief giving way to something colder. "I will not marry again." Gregory's smile hardened. "You will, or I will petition the court to declare you unfit to manage your estate. Grief has clearly clouded your judgment." "And if I refuse?" "Then I will take control of this house," he said calmly, "and I will remove whatever influence has led you astray." She knew exactly what he meant. That night, Josephine did not go to the library. She sent a message instead, a single line passed through a maid who owed her a quiet loyalty. "Come to the garden." Samuel arrived under cover of darkness, his face drawn tight with worry. Josephine told him everything: the marriage, the threat, the court. "There's no time," she said. "They will separate us. They will destroy you." Samuel closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked very young. "Then we have to leave." The words fell like stones into water. "Charleston," she whispered. "Everything," he said. "The house, the books, the life they want you to live." Fear surged, then clarity. Josephine thought of the pages she had written in the margins of borrowed books, of the stories Samuel had read aloud, giving her back her own mind, of a future that did not suffocate. "Yes," she said, "we leave." They planned in fragments and whispers, money hidden inside hems, papers copied by hand, names of Quaker contacts memorized, then burned. Samuel warned her of patrols, of informers, of the price on literacy itself. On the third night after their decision, Gregory acted. The library door was forced open before midnight. Samuel was dragged into the courtyard, hands bound, the book he had been reading torn from his grasp. Josephine arrived seconds later, breathless, the taste of panic sharp on her tongue. "This is what I warned you about," Gregory said, holding up the book as if it were contraband poison. "A slave who reads, a widow who indulges him." Samuel said nothing. He looked only at Josephine. She stepped forward. "He did nothing without my permission." Gregory laughed. "That's the problem. The fire was ordered built. Books were brought out, armfuls at a time. Pages tore. Ink bled into ash. The library was being executed piece by piece, and Samuel, bound and silent, stood beside it, waiting for a punishment no one dared yet name aloud. The crisis had arrived fully formed, and there would be no retreat without loss. Charleston, South Carolina, April 1832. The fire caught quickly. Dry paper curled and blackened, the margins Josephine had filled with careful handwriting vanishing first, as if the flames knew exactly where to strike. The smell was sharp and bitter, ink and leather and something else. Hope, burning too fast to save. Samuel stood with his wrists bound, rope biting deeper as he shifted his weight. Two men flanked him. Gregory Merriweather watched the blaze with satisfaction, as if order were being restored one page at a time. "This ends tonight," Gregory said. "Reading, writing, delusions." Josephine stepped forward before fear could stop her. "If you harm him," she said, "you will answer for it." Gregory turned, amused. "Answer to whom? You?" Yes, she said. Her voice did not break. To me. Laughter rippled through the small crowd of servants and hired men. Someone stoked the fire higher. A book split open with a sound like bone cracking. Take him away, Gregory ordered. At dawn, he goes south, far south. The word carried its own sentence. They moved Samuel toward the gate. Josephine's breath shortened. The world narrowed to motion and heat, and the certainty that if she waited even 1 second longer, it would be too late. Stop, she said. No one did. She lunged forward, grabbing the iron poker from beside the fire. Sparks leapt as she swung it down, not at a man, but at the rope. The blow jarred her arms to the shoulder. The knot loosened, then gave. Samuel's hands came free. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then everything exploded. A guard rushed her. Samuel stepped between them, shoving the man back hard enough to send him sprawling. Another reached for Samuel's collar. Samuel ducked, elbowing him in the ribs, breath bursting from the man's lungs. Run, Samuel said. Josephine did not argue. They ran through smoke and shouting, past the burning barrel, past the servants frozen by fear or loyalty or both. The night tore open around them. Somewhere behind, Gregory's voice rose, furious, promising pursuit. They reached the garden wall. Samuel vaulted it first, turned and caught Josephine under the arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Her shoes hit the ground on the other side. They ran again, down alleys slick with salt air, through streets where lanterns swung and dogs barked toward the docks. The harbor was chaos at night. Ropes, crates, men shouting in 6 tongues. Samuel led without hesitation, weaving through shadow and movement. At the far end of the wharf, a small fishing boat rocked against its moorings. A Quaker contact waited, face pale, eyes sharp. Hurry, he said. They're already talking. Footsteps thundered behind them. Samuel pushed Josephine into the boat. A hand grabbed his coat. He twisted free, tearing fabric, and jumped as the Quaker cut the line. The boat lurched away from the dock. A gunshot cracked the air. Wood splintered near the bow. Josephine screamed. Samuel pulled her down, shielding her as the sail caught wind. The shoreline receded, lights blurring, voices dissolving into distance. They did not stop shaking until Charleston became a dark line against darker water. Only then did Josephine begin to cry. Samuel held her as the boat pitched, his own breath ragged, adrenaline still burning through his veins. It's over, he said, though he did not yet believe it. The journey north was a gauntlet. They hid in marshes while patrol boats passed. They slept in barns and safe houses, moving by night, memorizing faces they could never write down. Once, men came too close, lantern light sweeping the trees. Samuel pressed Josephine into the mud, covering her mouth with his hand as dogs barked yards away. They lay still until dawn bled the danger away. Every night, when it was safe enough to breathe, Samuel read. Not from books, they had none left, but from memory. Passages learned by heart, lines of poetry reconstructed word by word. Josephine listened with her eyes closed, the rhythm steadying her, reminding her who she was becoming. In Philadelphia, they stopped running. Quakers took them in without questions that demanded answers. Papers were drawn, names recorded, freedom written and witnessed. Samuel signed his name with a hand that shook. They married in a plain meeting house with open windows. Josephine wore a simple dress. Samuel stood barefoot on clean wood. When asked to speak, Josephine surprised herself by answering aloud, her voice strong, unafraid. I choose him, she said, and I choose the life we make together. Years later, when the danger had softened into memory, they wrote, together. They told the truth in careful sentences, about laws that feared letters, about love born in margins, about a city that tried to burn a mind alive. The book found its readers. The story traveled farther than either of them ever had. Charleston never apologized, but the words survived, and so did they. Philadelphia and beyond, 1832 to 1879. Freedom did not arrive with trumpets. It came quietly, like a door opening without resistance. In Philadelphia, Josephine and Samuel learned how to live without looking over their shoulders. At first, even simple acts felt unreal. Josephine chose her own books from shelves open to everyone. Samuel read aloud in daylight, his voice no longer pressed into secrecy. Each ordinary freedom carried the aftertaste of danger, a reminder of how recently it had been denied. They married in a Quaker meeting house with bare wooden benches and sunlight spilling through unadorned windows. No rings were exchanged, no vows were spoken loudly, but when they sat side by side in silence, their hands touching, it felt more binding than any ceremony Josephine had ever witnessed in Charleston. Josephine worked as a teacher, guiding children through letters with the patience of someone who understood what words could cost. Samuel found work as a clerk for a small abolitionist printer, surrounded by ink and paper that no longer needed hiding. At night, they wrote. At first, Josephine's hand trembled when she put her thoughts to the page, as if someone might burst in and tear them away. Samuel would sit across from her, reading each paragraph aloud, steady and affirming, giving her courage back sentence by sentence. They chose a shared name for their work, J.S. Freeman. Not to hide, but to declare. Their first novel was published quietly, then spread like something alive. Readers recognized the truth beneath the fiction. They saw themselves in the woman who had been silenced, in the man whose mind was treated as contraband. The book was read in parlors, in churches, in secret meetings where people spoke of a different future. Charleston tried to forget them, but the words traveled farther than memory could suppress. They had children who grew up surrounded by books, who learned early that stories were not escapes, but tools. Josephine taught them that imagination was a responsibility. Samuel taught them that knowledge was never neutral and never free of consequence. When Samuel died in 1879, Josephine sat beside him and read aloud one last time. Not from a printed page, but from memory. The first story he had ever read to her. The one that taught her she was allowed to choose. After he was gone, she continued writing. When she died years later, she was buried beside him beneath a simple stone. No titles, no explanations, only their names and a single line carved beneath them. Words gave them freedom. Love gave them courage. Their story was never meant to be extraordinary. It was meant to be true. And in that truth, it outlived them. The story is over, but the pain of that era still resonates. How are you feeling right now? Are you listening to this story alone or with someone? Share your feelings and where you are right now.